Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and we had a lot of fun earlier this week counting down my top 20 favorite death metal bands of all time, so I thought, why not continue on with that? So today, I'm going to be counting down the top 10 greatest death metal albums of all time. And of course, there are so many classic death metal records out there, so obviously I couldn't fit all of them in the top 10, but, when it comes down to it, it's a matter of, incorporating personal preference as well as the legacy a lot of these albums left behind and the influence they had as well. So, when it comes down to it, a lot of factors at play there, but yeah, I recognize that I'm not going to be able to fit all of the great death metal albums into a top 10, but just to make things more challenging for myself, I am limiting myself to one pick per band. Getting us started here in the top 10, I'm going to go with Death Shall Rise by Cancer, released in 1991, and two words here. James Murphy does an incredible job on this record. Really, his playing is what puts it over the top for me. Murphy is probably one of my all-time favorite death metal guitarists. The guy is an absolute visionary who did some fantastic work with a number of great bands over the years, including with Cancer on their sophomore record. It is the only album in the Cancer catalog to feature James Murphy, but he outdoes himself here on this fantastic album, in my opinion. And at 36 minutes long, it's not a very lengthy listen, but it's hard-hitting and insanely heavy from top to bottom, in my opinion, and absolutely one of the all-time best sophomore releases in death metal history. So with that in mind, it gets us started here in the top 10. Coming in at number 10, I gotta go with 1991's Death Shall Rise by Cancer. Next, number 9, let's go with Obscura by Gorguts, released in 1998. I mean, what a dizzying, jarring album, to be honest, right? It was my introduction to Gorguts, and, it was a record that before I had heard it, I had heard so many people beaming over this record and heaping so much praise on it. So when I was first getting into the band, I thought, what the heck, let's start off with this record. And yeah, it took a few listens to get into. It's very eccentric and out there, right? Gorguts can be a little jarring upon a first listen, but over time I grew to really appreciate the experimentation on this record, leading to one of the most complex and important albums in all of technical death metal, and it's a record that the band have since credited as a defining moment for their sound, with, brutal riffs and song structures that I enjoy quite a bit, so I definitely agree with that, and with that in mind, they're going to be my number 9 on the list, with Obscura from 1998. Gotta go with this classic by Gorguts. It's definitely safe to say that melodic death metal as we know and love it today would be a very different scene if not for At the Gates and their fourth studio album released in 1995, Slaughter of the Soul, my number 8 here on the list. The release of this record definitely did help to popularize the Gothenburg scene alongside bands like In Flames and Dark Tranquillity, not to mention the incredible guest guitar solo here by Andy LaRocque on the track Cold, which is hands down one of the all-time best guitar solos in all of death metal, and one that's still hard to replicate to this day by anybody else. So, an amazing record here, of course, very important, and like I said, bands like At the Gates and In Flames, Dark Tranquillity, so crucial to the Gothenburg metal scene and what would define that melodic death metal sound of that scene for many years to come. Following that up now with my number 7, let's go with Left Hand Path by Entombed, released in 1990. It's their debut record here, of course, Entombed, Swedish death metal legends, and this is a very important album because it's one of, if not the first album to showcase that buzzsaw-esque sound, guitar tone that helped to define the Swedish death metal sound and style and really separate it from its US counterpart, and many bands of that scene would later go on to adopt that as well. So very important record here, highly influential for, incorporating that buzzsaw sound that would be used for decades to come for other bands in the Swedish death metal scene. So Entombed kind of started all of that in 1990 with Left Hand Path, their iconic debut record. Going to be my number 7 here on the list today. I had talked about the iconic sophomore release, Death Shall Rise, earlier, so here's another amazing sophomore record for you. Coming in at number 6, let's go with Cause of Death by Obituary from 1990. It's their first studio album to feature bassist Frank Watkins, and the only in the Obituary catalog to feature James Murphy. Total legend, like I had said. Love his work, but interestingly enough, Murphy didn't contribute much to the songwriting of this record, and most of the riffs that he brought in ended up being used on Disincarnate's only studio album instead, so that's kind of interesting, but nevertheless, this is a classic from top to bottom, including an amazing cover of Celtic Frost's Circle of the Tyrants. Really great stuff here, in my opinion, and a killer second album in the Obituary catalog. One of my all-time favorite death metal bands with an absolute home run here in 1990. We break into the top 5 now with Carcass and their 1993 release, Heartwork. In this record here, this is really where Carcass broke through the mold, and, it's an album that shows the strides the band had taken to polish their sound while also staying true to their style as well. right? It's a melodic death metal classic and a true staple of extreme metal that still holds up, say, right 30 years later. I think it's turning 30 years old this year, so still holds up 3 decades later, and it could have been released like yesterday, the way that it sounds, right? It's aged extremely well. I do love this record and never get tired of hearing it, so I definitely had to put it in the top 5. So getting us started in the top 5 here, let's go with Heartwork by Carcass, released in 1993, just a total classic. Classic Barnes era Cannibal Corpse here, coming in at number 4. Let's go with Tomb of the Mutilated from 1992. It's the last to feature the band's original lineup, and looking at the track listing, it's a record that is absolutely stacked with some of the absolute best in the Cannibal Corpse catalog, but, it's one of the reasons I'm more partial to the Chris Barnes era is because of this record, featuring the classic hammer-smashed face, which I think I can appropriately say is to the band what Hallowed Be Thy Name is to Iron Maiden, right? So, I think that's a fair comparison in that sense, right? Very important song to the band and would go on to become one of the best known and famous death metal songs of all time. Truly a rallying cry for Cannibal Corpse. And, I've talked about this at length before, Corpse Grinder Fisher versus Chris Barnes, who was the better vocalist and frontman for the band. It's all fantastic stuff, even though I'm a bit more partial to the early stuff in the Barnes era, including this album here, Tomb of the Mutilated. It's all fantastic, so whatever, era of the band you're a fan of, right, it's all good stuff. There's really no debate there in that sense. So for me, I have to go with Tomb of the Mutilated today by Cannibal Corpse, but if I wasn't limiting myself to one pick per band, there's a great chance that I'd be including some classics from the Corpse Grinder Fisher era as well. But that in mind, one per band here, I gotta go with Tomb of the Mutilated from 1992. Top 3 now, I'm gonna go with Like an Ever-Flowing Stream by Dismember. It's a perfect album of early 90s Swedish death metal, right? Dismember put everybody on notice here, the entire scene on notice with their debut from 1991. And this album, alongside marquee releases by bands like Grave, Unleashed, and Entombed, really did put Swedish metal on the map in a major way. It's 31 minutes of pure death metal essential listening just from top to bottom here, and I definitely think it's fair to say that from here on forward on this list, we're in the perfect album territory. 1988 was just a great year for metal in general, right? As well as for the formative years of death metal as well, right? It's really where death metal would start to take shape with bands like Death, Possessed, and Morbid Angel all coming into their own. And with that said, Morbid Angel going to be my number 2 here on the list with Altars of Madness, providing some of the first examples of death metal on this record here. It's easily one of the most influential death metal albums of all time and set a standard for sonic and lyrical heaviness in the death metal discography, in the death metal genre, and of course in the Morbid Angel discography with some standout tracks on here like Immortal Rites, Maze of Torment, which is fantastic, Visions from the Dark Side, Chapel of Ghouls, and more. Just an iconic record here, and like I had said before, we're now in perfect album territory, and I don't think there's a bad song on this album at all. Before I get to my number 1 pick here, I do have a few honorable mentions to give out, so want to give some special recognition here to Those Once Loyal by Bolt Thrower, Effigy of the Forgotten by Suffocation, None So Vile by Cryptopsy, Mental Funeral by Autopsy, and Sinister Slaughter by Macabre. All great records, but I can only fit 10 on the list here today. And finally, coming in at number 1, I'm going to go with Death and Symbolic from 1995, and I mean, the opening riff on the title track alone is enough to secure this album the number 1 spot, in my opinion, but seriously, this album and the way that shows Death's evolution of their sound and the progression as well of their sound, incorporating elements of melodic and technical death metal, all coming to a head on this record, really is outstanding in my opinion. Alright, this is a masterful blend of both, and everything we love about the undisputed kings of death metal as well. In my opinion, Chuck Schuldiner hit an absolute home run here, and it's a truly flawless masterpiece as far as I'm concerned. Death are another band where I don't think they have a bad album, so limiting myself to 1 pick per band was very difficult, especially for Death, because I could have easily gone with Leprosy. I could have gone with, The Sound of Perseverance as well, but ultimately I think Symbolic is their best studio record here, with some great standouts like the title track, like I had mentioned, that awesome riff, Zero Tolerance, Empty Words, A Thousand Eyes, Without Judgment, Crystal Mountain, Perennial Quest. Awesome stuff here. True essentials, and this is just an absolute masterpiece. So, with that in mind, it's my number 1 on the list here today. Going to go with 1995's Symbolic by Death, my favorite death metal album of all time. So, that wraps up this list here, counting down the top 10 greatest death metal albums of all time, which should be visible right over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below. We are just 7 subscribers away from getting to 1.6 thousand. If you've not subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do so. It is greatly appreciated. Be sure to turn on the bell for notifications so you never miss a new upload. And let me know down in the comment section below, what are some of your favorite death metal albums of all time? I want to hear from you. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.